Now, I'm thrilled to be introducing a person that has taken it on himself, both through sharing his own story and sharing some of the things that we need to consider to help us combat some of the systemic issues that we deal with. Actually, Aaron Dorkin, who is LGW class of 19, had reached out to me to go to a book signing by Dax. For some reason, I couldn't go. Ended up having a conversation, fell in love with his story, read his book, had him on the Partnering Leadership podcast, and I said, we have to have him with Leadership Greater Washington. Dax himself runs a social impact consulting firm where he helps organizations bridge the gap between the intentions and the words and the actual practices. And one of the frustrations I know a lot of us have is that the second something happens, the press releases are beautiful. The statements are right there. But you can go back 2 years, 6 years, 12 years, 20 years, and see some of those same statements without much progress. Dax works to bridge that gap. Dax Devlon-Ross, we are thrilled to have you with Leadership Greater Washington and really excited after spending some time in New York. Dax has chosen to come back to Washington, D.C. In this region. We're thrilled to have you. And additionally, one more piece on Dax. He is now daddy of two, including a 5-month-old that keeps him up quite a bit. Dax is hopeful that tonight is going to be the night that they're going to get him to sleep through the night. And before this conversation, I told him, I'm not sure if that's going to happen. But that was the negative part of this conversation. Now we'll turn to Dax for more positive and constructive things we can do. Dax, welcome.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you for having me. Thank you to all the people that just making some time in the middle of their day to just be part of this conversation. I'm hoping that we can keep this pretty informal, pretty light, and even though the subject matter can sometimes feel heavy and burdensome. And I know, Mahan's going to be asking some questions, but I hope other folks can get some questions in as well. But I did prepare just a couple of early remarks, really, really light touch remarks, because I wanted to just set the stage for who I am. We can talk about the work I do. You can buy the books, you can find all that stuff, but I really wanted to just connect with people around my stories and stories that have been influential and to sort of shaped how I've entered into the workforce, into the world, and operate in the world right now. So I start by just the question, who am I? And I answer that question by saying I'm a DC kid. And it is very important that I name that. I spent 20 years in New York, but DC never left my heart, never left who I am. My mother worked on Marion Barry's first campaign. She worked in city government. She worked in the Franklin Reeves building on, some folks might know, on 14th Street, right off U Street, for 30 some years. So and my father went to Howard University and studied engineering. Very proud to say graduated president of his class in 1964, just a few weeks before the signing of the Civil Rights Bill that changed my life, his life, and so many other people's lives. And it's really important to name that because so much of who I am in the world is a function of having been born at a particular time that I was born, which is in the mid-1970s in Washington, D.C., in a place where there was an unique set of opportunities. And despite, of course, what we've already heard, that there's poverty here. I know that, I'm very clear about that. But the opportunities that were afforded me as a black boy growing up in this city were unlike those that were available to a lot of kids my age in other parts of this country. I like to say that I grew up in a neighborhood that was predominantly Black. It was called Shepherd Park, way uptown. If you've been up 16th Street, it's one of the last neighborhoods before you get to the Maryland line. I grew up keenly aware of the racial and class divides. And as a minority, I attended a school in DC, Sidwell Friends, and I was very keenly aware at that time, going through that experience, of myself as a minority in that experience. And at the same time, when I was outside of that space, I was aware of myself as a middle-class Black kid in a city that was being overtaken at that time by crack. And so I think that particular dichotomy, that dialectic, that tension, that not having a specific space and a place that it necessarily felt as though I was situated as, the norm, was very challenging for me, but at the same time, it became a kind of basis for how I interact with the world, interact with organizations, interact with clients. I see myself as an insider outsider, someone who is both inside of experiences and also able to step outside of them and hold a mirror for folks. So I want to tell you a bit of a story about just my experience moving to New York, because it's important and integral to who I am and how I show up in the world. So after I finished law school, I went to law school at George Washington Law School, as a matter of fact. After I finished law school, I packed my bags while all my friends were studying for the bar, and I drove to New York because I was going to be a writer. And that was very important to me, and that was what I wanted for my life. I moved into a buddy's spare bedrooms, and he actually lived in Newark at the time. So I didn't even live in New York initially. I lived in Newark and had to take the train into the city every day. I barely had barely any money. Didn't even remember having a bank account, to be quite honest. But I really had this dream of becoming a writer, and that was very important to me. I had this law degree, and I thought that because I had a law degree from a top 20 law school, that would open doors for me. I was under the belief that that would be, that was what I had been told, that if I just go through school, get the education, follow the rules, do everything I'm supposed to do, the doors should open. And I really did believe that as a young American. So I sent out resumes and I applied for every job that I could think of, everywhere. And I got a couple of callbacks and an interview here and there. Lots of "we love yous" and "you're great," right? But no offers. And frankly, it was baffling to me, right? And embarrassing, to be quite honest. And all of my law school friends who'd also moved to New York at the same time, they found jobs, and I couldn't even get a paralegal gig. So my first official job was in the mailroom at a nonprofit law publishing house. So it was in the mailroom. Now I had a law degree, almost 7 figures, almost I should say 6 figures of debt, and I couldn't get a real job. I was paid $15 a day and all the books that I could take home in my gym bag. But that was with the price I was willing to pay, because I believed if I wanted to get into publishing, I had to start at the bottom. A few months passed and an editorial assistant position opened up. And editorial assistant positions, if you don't know, they aren't glamorous. They pay terribly, but they're essential if you want to get ahead in the publishing game, at least, which is what I wanted. So I applied and I went through the process of interviewing, and I thought I had a pretty good shot since I had been interning for the few months that I had already been there, and I got to know the editorial staff. My competitor for the job was a young woman who had just graduated from college and had just started working in the same mailroom with me, and actually I ended up training this young woman. She and I were friendly, but I figured having a law degree should matter and have some weight and some relevance in this context, right? So the day the decision was to be made, it was to be announced, the hiring editor called me into her office. And this is really important. She sat me down, and I'll never forget the way the sun was shining through her back window in her office that day. She said she wasn't giving me the job, and she was going to give it to the young woman. But what she said is what I'll never forget. She said, "Dax, I see you on a different trajectory." There was no actual feedback, right? There was no honest feedback, just a polite, and I can say many years later, very condescending and patronizing assessment of my potential. I wasn't a fit. So I'd never considered that systemic bias could be at play in the workplace until that experience. In the same way I had experienced arrest in law school, and that it lifted a veil over my eyes around how the criminal justice system operates. That early experience in publishing, it lifted a veil for me on the world of work. Not only would I have to survive in New York on starvation wages if I wanted to get into publishing, I had to fit an undefined but clearly understood, by some at least, profile in this hiring manager's head. So fit in publishing, I came to learn, meant having attended a liberal arts college, preferably of a New England vintage, and ideally an Ivy League school. In other words, a prerequisite for entry into the industry that delivers our collective ideas at scale was familiar resources and credentials to which only a narrow slice of our society has access. In that way, it was not a malice-driven racism that produced a sea of whiteness in the publishing world. The fact that the industry was overwhelmingly white was merely a reflection of arrangements undergirded by beliefs of certain people's worthiness that went and still go largely unchallenged. So another major turning point in my life and in my education on systemic bias came a decade later. when I was reporting. I had become a journalist at this point, on a story about a law that had been passed in North Carolina called the Racial Justice Act. It was the first of its kind. The law sought to end the exclusion of Black jurors from criminal trials, specifically capital trials in North Carolina. And it's a practice that still remains rampant in our society today. If you recall, in the Ahmaud Arbery case just a few months ago, and in fact, of course, there was a verdict that was quite favorable to many people, I'm sure, on this call. Nevertheless, 11 out of the 12 jurors in that trial were white, despite the fact that the county in which it took place was more than 25% African American. What's going on here? So by the time I started to fly down to North Carolina to report on this story, the law was already under attack. And from the start, the state's 44 district attorneys had fought passionately against the Racial Justice Act. Now, they took issue with the suggestion that there was racial bias in the courts, and they warned the public that millions would be wasted on appeals and experts, not to mention feeding and housing murderers for life. The head of North Carolina's District Attorneys Association acknowledged bias might exist when I interviewed her, and she said, but she insisted, to say that these district attorneys were intentionally racially biased is really, and she stopped and she paused. The DAs just find that to be a really repugnant thought, and they just object. In fact, the law's proponents had not claimed that the DAs were intentionally biased. The assertion was that their decision-making history demonstrated unconscious bias. A statistical analysis demonstrated that over the previous 20 years and across every county in the state of North Carolina, the district attorneys were at least twice as likely to strike Black jurors from service than they were white jurors. The state's GOP leadership rejected the assertion of bias out of hand. And I don't believe that the DAs across the state, particularly most of whom are Democrats, are racist, one of the senators said at the time. So on one side, you had hard data, and on the other, you had what I call disbelief. And in that instance, disbelief won. The disbelief I encountered in my reporting helped me make sense of something that Brian Stevenson, who was an expert witness in the RJA court hearings at the time, told me when I spoke to him way back in 2012. It's not overt, he said. I'm not saying anybody hates African Americans. I'm not saying that they want to see lynching. They have underdeveloped understandings of the ways that racial bias manifests itself and plays out in the system of justice. They have thought very little about it, he said to me. While reporting on the RJA, the Racial Justice Act, I got to know another professor out of Tufts University, a psychologist by the name of Sam Summers. In his expert testimony, Summers had told the court that in a jury selection experiment that he conducted in order to measure implicit bias, participants were 25% more likely to challenge a prospective Black juror than they were a white juror, even when given the exact same profile. And that wasn't even his big reveal. Participants in the study, he said, overlooked the very attributes and background information, that is to say, education, jobs, personal information, in a white prospective juror that they then questioned when the juror was Black. Importantly, though, none, not even one of these people in his experiment ever cited race in their reason for striking a Black juror. It was always something else, some other reason, some other explanation. So Stevenson's and Summers, their insights and their analysis, they opened up a door in my brain, and they shifted the way that I've since thought about and approached equity issues. And before I spoke to Stevenson and Summers, I was angry. The hypocrisy and willful disbelief that I encounter, it just astounded me. The desire to deny that there's persistent inequities that we see in our society that are so clearly linked to a history of bias and live within us all, it infuriates me. But since speaking to Stevenson, I approach what I call white disbelief as a competency issue. In that instance, North Carolina prosecutors told themselves that because they were not rejecting Black jurors on explicitly racial terms, i.e. because they were Black, they were free to use an assortment of colorblind rationales that were linked, nevertheless, to white supremacist ideology to strike them from the pool. So such things as appearance and attitude and dress and body language, and my favorite catch-all, any other sign of defiance, sympathy with the defendant, or antagonism to the state. Those can all be legitimately used as reasons to strike people from service. But those words don't have to scream race in order to mean race. Whose appearance, whose attitude, whose dress, whose body language is frequently the subject of crippling stereotypes? Is defiance not a term that is often applied to people when they stand up for their rights, when they challenge the status quo? So up until then, I have been taught to think of racism as something that affects people of color only. And by identifying these as gaps in competency, literally learning deficits, I started to draw a different, at least equally important conclusion, which is this, that racism warps us all. The maladies merely manifest themselves differently on those it advantages than on those it oppresses. The education I had received had also failed my white friends. The silence and the shame around our past had also denied them the ability to develop the lenses, the language, and even the empathy to engage with racial bias as a defining feature of the American life that we share, as something that is part of our collective story, whether we are conscious of it or not. And because they didn't understand how their lives and their views may have been shaped by their identity, because it was hard and confusing to consider themselves as part of an advantaged social identity in a society that places such value on individuals. It was far easier to blame Black people for being poor or for having too many children or for committing crime than it was to acknowledge that structurally, we maybe have arranged our society to marginalize, problematize, and ultimately punish Black folks. So why am I telling you this? Why are these stories relevant in this context, in this moment? I guess a more relevant question is, what do I do in the world? You heard a little bit about it already. I call myself a hybrid. I'm a writer and I'm also an equity practitioner. And in that regard, I coach, I consult, I lecture sometimes, I facilitate dialogues, I provide tactical and strategic support, all for the purposes, the agents of change. A lot of what I do is I hold up mirrors. I try to provoke really challenging conversations. I try to help people lean into the discomfort that they end up wanting to often lean away from because it's easier. Help people build trust with one another. Help people get clearer and honest about who they are and who they want to be. And what I'm really interested in right now in this particular moment in 2022, there are three things that I'm really interested in right now. I'm really interested in generational discord. A lot of the organizations I work with, I'm finding right now, specifically whether it's because of remote work, hybrid work, whatever you call it, or because of the ways in which people are interpreting the issues around race and around other identity challenges, there's very clearly a generational discord and disconnect happening. And I am very interested in, as particularly someone who identifies as a Gen Xer, someone who is almost in the middle of these boomers and these millennials who are often at odds with one another, and trying to find some ways and some pathways towards reconciliation. I'm also really interested in the ways in which leaders, and particularly BIPOC leaders, and particularly and especially women of color who are taking on leadership roles within organizations that have been led by white folks beforehand, how they're entering those spaces, because that is a very challenging and fraught space that people often assume is going to be sort of easy to do, but comes with a variety of complications because of the expectations that are often thrust upon people of color when they enter in leadership positions. There's an expectation that you have a certain politics, a certain set of values, and if you don't live up to that, you may not be quote unquote Black enough or what it is enough. So I'm interested in that work as well. And I'm also finally really interested in right now in how organizations can actually operationalize, that is, truly live into their commitments that they've made a couple of years ago now, yes, 2 years ago now, to racial justice. What I'm really concerned about right now is that as I look across this vast divide, this vast country, I see a distinct disparity, a distinct absence of trust. I see a failure of imagination for building new structures. I see also a lack of humanity and tolerance for one another, even in progressive spaces that I find myself in at times. There is often even a lack of willingness to acknowledge people who might have a different point of view, even in a progressive space. And I am finally really concerned about the backsliding that I think is already happening in organizations. Already seeing that folks who might have had work that they were planning to do around equity, around race, around justice, putting it on hold, pushing it off to later in the year, finding some reason not to do it, telling themselves that they've done enough already. I'm really concerned that whatever interest and focus and energy that was present a year and 2 years ago is already beginning to wane. And so I want to find the way and find the words and find the language and find the tools to help people to stay true to the things that they said that they wanted to do. So I'll pause with that and I want to open it up for some conversation with Mahan, but I wanted to at least give you a sense of who I am, what brought me to the work I do, and what do I care about. So thank you for being here, and I hope we have an interesting conversation.
And thank you for laying that context out, Dax, because your personal context and your own personal story contributes a lot to our understanding. And I really appreciate that. I've already gotten a lot of great questions. So, first off, just a curiosity, we've got a question on what were the considerations that got you to pursue a law degree, given that you were interested in becoming a writer?
So here's another part where it's very connected to identity. You know, when you are, and this is, I think, true of immigrant communities as well, but I think the American story and the American journey to the middle class is such it's a tenuous one. And of course, the middle class is even an ephemeral term. What does it really even mean? But it's such an ephemeral and tenuous one for particularly folks of color, Black folks, especially in this country, that whenever you get a foothold, the anxiety that a parent might have is that, can we keep that foothold? And so I want you, therefore, to choose a career path that is going to get you the surest bet, the surest pathway. So historically, that had been become a teacher, a preacher, or open a funeral home. But as pathways have opened up generationally, it's get a medical degree, get to become a lawyer, do something that will give you a very solid career path and a solid income. And that was very much the case for me. I was counseled by everybody in my life, don't do the thing over here, do the thing over here. So I promised my family I would do the thing over here that they asked me to do. And then when I had done that, I went off to be a lawyer. But I would say that it has been valuable in my life. But that is the explanation for the why ultimately, is that it was in many respects, the respectable thing to do. It was the respectable middle class thing to do.
Thank you for that, Dax. And Felicia actually gives you a shout out for calling yourself a hybrid. And she says she's a hybrid native Washingtonian, also raised in a middle class environment. So it relates well to what you
Yeah,
said. Now, I'm going to ask a three-pronged question, Dax, building
sure.
off of what John Butler, my friend, it's great to have you part of the conversation. Uh, John says, given the mounting pushback we're seeing on anti-racism and inclusion initiatives, what suggestions would you have to offer on ways to combat it? Let's put that in one corner.
Hmm.
I want to marry that with John McWhorter and his book on woke racism, where he says much of the conversations that elite East Coast, primarily, he calls it NPR listening, New York Times reading, so on and so forth, are having on anti-racism are actually counterproductive. And I know you're familiar with his work. I
Yeah.
want to put that there. And the third piece is some of the people that I have conversations with feel that the conversation and the ability to have conversations around race and racism don't exist on either side. We've become so
Yeah.
polarized in some respects that with one set, if if there is anything that challenges the thinking,
Hmm.
there people are thrown out. Same thing on the other side. So would
Hmm.
love to marry those three, starting out
Yeah.
with John's question on some of the pushback on the inclusion and anti-racism work?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at our history in this country, pushback is inevitable. It happens every single time that there's any advance, specifically when we deal with race. I mean, Reconstruction, pushback. We look at civil rights movement, pushback. One of the things that Dr. King writes about in his final book, and of course his birthday is going to be celebrated in a couple of days, his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? He writes that book in 1967, 2 years after the passage of the voting rights legislation, and at a point that might be considered the nadir of his career. And it's largely because at that point in his career, he started to talk about Vietnam, he's talking about poverty, he's expanding his scope, and many white Americans were not comfortable with him having a voice in international context. But at that point already, we were seeing pushback. I think it's inevitable and inevitable that there will be a pushback. And that the problem I find is that people were not prepared for that. I'm like, did you not think there was going to be a point in time where people were going to start to resist resist? Have you not studied our history? So what my challenge is that steep yourself in history and understand that this is part of the dynamic that consistently exists in our country. Whenever there is a move towards some kind of progressive shift and change that might upend the status quo, we find ourselves with people starting to do, hold up, slow down, let's roll it back. We don't really mean it. And then people like John McWhorter are presented to us, because they are presented to us. And he is a smart guy and I respect his work, but he is very much presented to us. He has been given an opportunity to speak on every platform. He is a mouthpiece and a voice that many people who are not comfortable being out there and being vocal, he is that voice for them. My challenge with a person like my voice with a person like McWhorter is, I am concerned that he is not in community or relationship with anybody that actually he is talking about. He's having a conversation in an echo chamber, and he's speaking to people who are of like mind, and fine, those folks that exist out there. But have you ever sat in a space with someone like me or someone who actually holds the views and who's actually doing work in the world? Because actually, I spend time in organizational context. I'm actually in a lot of these nonprofits, grassroots organizations, and this is actually what they're talking about. It's not theoretical, hypothetical. This is actually what's going on, right? There is actual data that's demonstrating what's happening in our lives and how people are navigating that reality. So I'm not invalidating what he's saying. I'm just kind of wondering, who do you talk to really? Who are you outside of the parlors in your elite world that you operate in? Who are you in community with? Are you spending time, with women of color who are doing work at the intersection of all sorts of issues that are relevant to the lives of Black folks in the community? I don't know. Right. So that's my question and my doubt. And my wondering is that, why is this person always presented to us? Why is this voice in every major medium, every major outlet? You don't find my voice all over those places, right? His voice is in New York Times, Atlantic. Every time I look up, so that's communicating to me that there is a desire to have that voice be presented. That's totally fine, but let's be clear that that voice is representing a very small slice of, I would consider to be, Black folks who are very much invested in challenging status quo. And that isn't to say that you have to be completely lockstep and line with everything. I'm not myself. And I would even close by saying this. There are folks who will look at the work that I do in the world, and particularly the book that I've written, specifically it being Letters to My White Male Friends, and they'll say, Dax, you're not actually, woke enough. You're not an extreme progressive end enough. Why are you talking to white men? Why are you trying to be engaged with what that shouldn't even be a part of the conversations? I've gotten that feedback, right? So I know that there are internal dynamics. But I will close by saying this: even within the progressive movements in the 1960s, there were contentions between SNCC, Stokely Carmichael and what he was doing at the farther reaches and Martin Luther King and what he was up to, right? There's always been internal dynamics and conflicts within movements. So I think that it's important, again, to recognize that there is historical precedent for what we're experiencing now, learn from that history and not get caught in that cycle, and begin to continue to mobilize with people who you want to be in community with, and understand that it is not supposed to be smooth and perfect. Challenge is a part of the work. That just means, are you serious and you're legitimately going to stand in the truth of this work, the truth that you believe in it, or are you going to buckle just because you get pushback?
And to your point, I've heard McWhorter on almost every podcast I listen to. So
Everybody.
getting a lot of air, gets
A lot of
lot
airtime.
of airtime, and one of the challenges I have is that the solutions are when we get to the solutions are so insignificant. He
Right.
accepts that there is systemic racism. He criticizes the approach, and then the solutions don't match the challenge. But
Right. Right.
so
But
it is
again,
to your point, Dax, in that I think whether it is with the pandemic or with the anti-racism conversations, I like quoting Jim Collins had a conversation with Admiral Stockdale, who had been a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and
mhm.
he had been asked who were the people that gave up first. He said it was the optimists. It was the ones that thought
It's beautiful.
pretty
Yeah.
soon we're going to be freed, right? Come Christmas, come
Yeah.
Easter, and what he said is that you must never give up faith and hope and that belief that
Mm,
you will make it. However, not have that naive optimism that the work is going to be easy and it's going to be over soon,
right.
which is so relevant to the point that you're making. This is not just one spring of discontent based on George Floyd's murder and the statements that people make in the press. It
Right.
takes consistent effort. There will be progress. There will be
Yeah.
backward movement. So we have to stick to it.
I,
Now,
I, I I just
good.
want to say, like, I'm fascinated that, particularly when it comes to issues and work around race and equity, or anti-racism, we're so quick to want to give that up. But I look at so many other endeavors and enterprises that we engage in and allow to fail and allowed to demonstrate no progress for years and years and years, and we will continue to invest in those. And the moment that you've invested in DEI for 1 year and you don't see outcomes, you're ready to walk away from it already. So that tells to me that there wasn't really an investment in it in the first place, because there's plenty of things we invest in and allow those investments to bear fruit over a long period of time, and recognize that there's going to be ups and downs, backward and forwards. There's going to be oscillations. We recognize that. But when it comes to race, it's all or nothing. And if I don't see results tomorrow, it's not worth doing the work. Why is that? Why is that? So I appreciate that. I'm gonna have to use that, Collins. I love that quote. I'm gonna look it up myself. So appreciate you bringing that to the
We want to put a
conversation.
check mark in a box and move on, Dax, which is part of the problem. A lot of organizations
Well,
again
and
they
it's because it's uncomfortable, and the solutions are not easy, and the solutions are not always clear, and the solutions are different for every context. I think part of what I'm often challenged by in the work that I do is that people do want to be able to apply frameworks, and they want to apply frameworks and tools and resources to every context. Every context is different. Every specific organization is different. People's needs are different, and being able to be supple enough and nuanced enough to allow for the thing that needs to evolve and develop here. Maybe in this organization, it's like we really need to focus on hiring here, but over here we might need to focus on retention. Over here we might need to focus. So your focus is going to really be determined on some kind of audit of what's going on, and some kind of honest reflection on how am I contributing to that? What's my role in that? What am I willing to change? What am I really willing to change in the way I do things? And I think what we're encountering right now, what I think is fundamentally part of the big challenge, is that I think ultimately when it comes to, and I know you wanted to talk about this as well, like what's happened in school systems and how the school systems have been, in particular in parts of Virginia and other states in this country, there has been demonstrated resistance and pushback to the idea of some form of quote unquote critical race theory being imported into the schools. What that demonstrates to me is that these will be some of the same folks who are saying, I am all for, I am all about, I want to see X, Y, and Z. But the moment it enters into my sphere, I don't want it now. It's the NIMBY argument that we've always known has existed, not in my backyard. Like, yeah, it's great, but not here, right? And again, the question is why? What are you threatened by? What is the fear? What are you concerned by? I always say, like, if you look at the history of Black folks in America, we are some of the most inclusive people that you can ever imagine. Every time you look at about, I use this as a kind of as a as an analogy, I'm like, the 14th Amendment, which is one of the amendments that comes out of the emancipation process, has been used as the Equal Protection Clause in particular. It's been used and supported by and valued, become a value for every American. You know, the Equal Protection Clause is a direct descendant of the ending of slavery. So it is deeply connected to African American experience. It has benefited everybody. Civil rights legislation in the 1960s benefited everybody. Why do people assume that anything that is centering Black folks is excluding other folks? Actually, it's the other way around. Centering Black folks is historically shown that in this country, at least, it opens up pathways for plenty of other people's experience as well, because we are inclusive people. Sometimes people say we are too inclusive. We invite everybody in, you know, even to our own detriment. But we're never seen as that. It's always perceived that for some reason, when we start talking about race, we're narrowing things down too much. If we talk about race too much, we're not talking about other things. I think we're very intersectional people and have always been intersectional in our approach to things. And I would like for us to get that credit for being that way. You know, when Obama became president, he didn't just get a Black cabinet, did he? He actually had a so let's just be a bit more historical in our analysis of our perceptions of how Black folks approach these situations, and realize that we understand harm that's been done, and they're not trying to enact that same harm on other people. That's not the objective here. We want to create more inclusion for everybody. Just so happens that we have a very clear experience of it in this country, and it has something clear to articulate and say about our experience that others could possibly benefit from. I will stop and get off my high horse right now. Back to
I,
your question, sir.
one of the things I love about you, Dax, is your passion for this work, and it does take that the level of passion and commitment. And a point that you made me smile, because you're talking about the actions that need to follow, and even reflecting on some of the people in my neighborhood that on one end have Black Lives Matter signs up. On the other end, Montgomery County Schools was looking at and is looking at
Yeah,
distributing
busing. Yeah,
schools and
yeah,
kids to have more diverse classrooms.
yeah,
Those same people are standing
yeah,
against it, not
yeah.
not with my
Not my
kids,
children.
right?
And I get it and I feel it and I understand it and I understand it. But let's be in dialogue about it, right? Like, let's be in dialogue, because I think, you know, we're complex people, but I think if we can't recognize that and understand that there's a contradiction there. There's somehow our values that we're expressing to the world are not lining up with our actions. And how can well, what's happening there? There's a fear. There's a fear there. And that fear is coming from someplace that somehow that diversity is going to lower the quality, that somehow my child is going to be placed into a situation where they're going to be getting an inferior education. Well, why is that? Is it the perception that having Black kids in the classroom is lowering? Then that's some work you need to do then. That's some work, that's a place to do work. If there's a sense that just because if it's having some brown young folks in your class, it's gonna lower the quality, really? Where is the data to back this up? Where is it? Where are you showing? Where is that? That's just a feeling, right? That's a feeling, and that's a legitimate feeling. I'm not delegitimizing the feeling, but let's actually try to work with it versus just sitting in the discomfort that's being presented to you because change is being asked of us all.
Yeah. Now, sticking to that education, we've got a question, Dax. As a father who's grown up in a prestigious private PWI institution, but also someone who is taught in public institutions, how do you think about the best path for your own children?
Beautiful
I.e.,
question. Mm,
racial inequities in public K through
yeah,
12 education, the importance of representation and
yeah.
camaraderie for self-esteem and confidence building, etc.
Oh man. So I start always by this is that I don't mean this to denigrate education in any sort. Education for me really is, and it's become clearer and clearer to me, particularly given the pandemic. Like, it is my job, it is my wife's job, it is our family's job to really, really create an educational environment. I expect my school to supplement it. And I don't look to the school, I'm not offloading and I'm not sort of outsourcing the education of my children to the school and expecting that that's going to all happen out there, whether it's a great school, quote unquote, great school, or a school that is quote unquote not as great. Now, when it comes to my own experience, I am determined to begin my children's journeys in the public school system. Where my wife and I were very aligned on that. Where it becomes difficult is, what are the needs of that particular child? Like if the needs of of a young person are not being met, then that's a reason to make a decision that might be different, right? That's my choice, right? It's not going to be just as a default, the moment they turn 10, they go into private school. Like it's really going to be, where are they thriving? What are their needs? Are their learning needs being met? Then we can have a conversation. Of course, that's a conversation that people who have, a certain measure of resources can make. But I can tell you that my own experience of having gone to quote unquote elite private school is that there are things that are lost and missed in those experiences. And there's a lot of work I had to do on myself after those experiences to get whole and to get right, because a lot of my own sense of myself was not validated in that environment. And a lot of how I thought of myself as a student, as a young person, as a thinking person was missing when I left that environment. And I think I'm very clear that I had to go through another kind of education to get my sense of confidence and belief in myself back. So I don't look at that as a solve. I recognize that there are benefits and drawbacks to all of those things, but I do believe our public system and public schools are ones that are worth investing in, and that if we collectively are able to make some choices around, I'm in a neighborhood and I have friends in my neighborhood. We're talking to each other. We're sharing lists and thinking, because it's not just me there, it's you there too, you there too. There, we can have some strength in numbers, and we can actually start to influence some of the things that we want to have happen. And that's not a bad thing. I give credit to people in like a Park Slope in Brooklyn, for communities that have decided, listen, we're going to invest in and make sure that this public school has additional enrichment resources. That's a great thing. I'm not mad at people for doing that. I want to do that with my people. I want my friends to do that same thing. I'm not going to be mad because you did it. I want to go and do the same thing. So it's an ongoing conversation. I'm being transparent and saying I have not resolved it myself, but I also know that it's going to be public schools first and foremost, and we will then revisit it depending on what the children need.
So Bill Fogarty says your book contains so much food for thought. I especially appreciated the section on the culture of expropriation. Can you talk a bit about the DC portion of that section, and want today's audience, what you would want today's audience to know about that, the history of your father's sale of his building,
Yeah.
or Alice Rivlin's oversight, the dog walker at Howard, what can be done
I
now
love
to
it. He read the
deal
book.
with
I'm sure.
displacement. So this is everyone needs to also read the book. We've got a few other questions too, because I know this can take the rest of the
No, well,
hours. Some thoughts on this.
well, so just to get first of all, Bill, thank you for reading the book. Thank you for for having like a reaction, because I think that's a chapter that's very important to me. I When you grow up in a city like DC and you begin to, and even though I was coming back and forth and traveling back and forth to New York, I started to see these shifts and changes. You start to see them in earnest. I remember that it was called the MCI Center first. Like that was what it was first called. That big, that was like a big deal when that center was built. Now is it called the Verizon? I don't even know what it's called anymore. It's changed names so many times, but it's where the Wizards play, and the Mystics play as well, and the Capitals. But that was a big deal because at that point, many folks in this call know that DC at that time, downtown DC, there was not much happening down there. Then the U Street corridor in the late 90s begins to start to emerge as well. You start to have some clubs down there, and I'm dating myself, like Republic Gardens and, a couple other places that were down in that neighborhood that started to bring the U Street that, had historically been there, that had not been sort of been revived for 30 years, bringing it back. And so we started to see those sort of things. I started to watch, as the 2000s evolved into like the 2010s, you start to see these real shift in the composition of the communities. And for me, as a person who had watched my father, who he had a business, he had bought a building on 14th, right off 13th and V Street. And I remember the building he bought with the intention of investing in the community, but also then watching that him get robbed repeatedly and the police not come, and there not seem to be any support for him or other people being present or whatever they needed or their needs were. But then to see that shift so dramatically when white people moved into those neighborhoods, see that policing began to actually be a serious priority, to see that commercial real estate begins to take interest in that neighborhood. And it's this idea that that when white people begin to inhabit a community, somehow it attracts commercial investment, it attracts public safety, it attracts all the things that when folks of color are there, particularly Black folks in a city like DC were there, those things were not happening. You can make a number of different explanations for why that was. Maybe there was, there wasn't the money. I don't know what it was. I don't know, but I could just say that was my observation, and it was really hard to watch, right? When I talked to Alice Rivlin, who, for some folks who might know Alice Rivlin, she's passed away, but she was part of the DC control board that was put in place after DC fell into serious arrears, and Marion Barrett is a long story around that. But she also had, she's a brilliant woman, but she was at the Brookings Institution back in the early 2000s, and they wrote a report. And that report basically gave DC some advice. If you want to revitalize the city, you have two choices. One, you can invest in like middle-class families, and you could really try to invest in making sure those middle-class families will thrive here. Or you can really invest in, building up the sort of environment that will be amenable to younger, upwardly mobile people. And it is very clear that the decision that was ultimately made based on that report was to go in the latter direction. So this city becomes and has become much more of a playground for the young, and for young people who are single or folks that are thriving. And that's the proliferation of condominiums and all sorts of things. Not just DC, it's happened in New York, it's happened in a variety of places. Why it's troubling to me is that there's a perception that when folks move in, that there was nothing here historically, that there was no thriving community, that people didn't want there to be a better neighborhood there, that's not a desire that they also had, that somehow people weren't taking advantage, they had let the neighborhood fall into disrepair, like just that was their choice that had happened, that they had allowed crack to just flood into the neighborhood, and they didn't, and it's like that's a really problematic perception of why change takes place. There are political choices that are geared towards and oriented to attract and draw people who have resources. And it is, in this country at least, the people who tend to have resources, and specifically disposable income, tend to also be white, right? So when we're making choices about how we're designing neighborhoods and design communities, if we're saying that we are going to build a kind of infrastructure and price things in such a way that only certain people can access, it stands to reason that it's going to become predominantly white after a period of time. And that's what happens, and it's happened into parts of DC. I have no problem. I mean, it's like, I love it. I enjoy the city as it is. But I also know that a lot of folks who wanted to be here couldn't stay here. Or a lot of folks who had invested a lot of their lives and a lot of their history in their city, they could not be here. And that creates resentment for some folks. And the fact that we don't have a space for dialogue about those feelings and experiences, it creates the conditions for that resentment to play out in a variety of unhealthy ways. So I just think that there are ways that cities can decide to evolve and develop and grow themselves responsibly and in partnership with the existing community and an emerging community, such that the people who are there and present don't feel like they were just pushed out and didn't have a space. And we have to recognize that as a country, that is linked to a culture of expropriation that goes back to settler colonialism. Settler colonialism was all about coming onto land that we perceived to not be used in the ways we thought it should be used. Oh, these native folks, these indigenous people are not using the land. They're not developing it, they're not putting up buildings, they're not creating stores, so therefore they don't value it, forgetting or disregarding the fact that they have a different relationship to the land, right? And so that settler colonialist mindset still kind of operates in the gentrification context. And that's what I'm perceiving, like this notion that there's nothing here and we are coming to create progress. It's this teleological idea of progress being sort of beautification, not progress being how do we kind of find a way for all of us to be here together and to us being community together. That's what I was trying to get at in this idea of a culture of appropriation and expropriation, and being aware that sometimes you can be easily a participant in that without even being consciously aware that that's what's going on. And it's important to be aware and be conscious that that those are choices at the real estate level that are being made both for us and by us.
Few more to quickly get to Montez Anderson. That said, I think
Montez, it's my boy.
He went to high school with you. I'm sorry to hear that, Dax.
We went to middle school together. And
Montez, by the way, is a newish dad also, if you didn't know.
I know, same time. He's an old dad like me. We're both like old dads,
Yeah, you're better looking than Montez.
I know. Please.
So Montez says, while we see pushback from some conservatives around the country in a variety of ways, do you see unconscious bias racism within white progressive liberal circles, and how do we deal with that?
I mean, I think this is a really great and important question. And I think because I think it's something that shows up a lot as a challenge point in progressive and liberal spaces around the role of of white people in those movement spaces, and the extent to which uh, you know unconscious bias can play out in a variety of ways in which decisions gets made, who gets to be in charge, who's making this, who's calling the shots. And so I absolutely have seen it and experienced it, and I have seen and experienced it in myself. Like, I'm very clear that I am also a product of socialization in this country. I'm also a product of a society that has oriented me to have a perception of what is better, what is not better, what is worse, who belongs, who does not belong. And I have to work on a daily basis to interrupt those narratives myself. So I don't only put that work on people, on white people who are in progressive spaces, because I recognize that I have my own work that I am in place to doing. And part of what I write the book and talk about in the book is the work I have to do. Growing up middle class in a society such as ours, particularly growing up in black middle class in a place like DC, you are socialized to think that you are better than other folks. There's a socialization process that happens in there, and it is crude and it is unhealthy and it is unhelpful. But I do hear the point. There is there's a sort of larger frame that I think Montez is getting at around, like, how do we address those sorts of things in a way that doesn't push people away? But just because you might have something unconscious going on and implicit doesn't mean you're not down or don't want to be part of it. It just means that you all are, you have some competency areas that you need to develop. The question is, if I give you feedback about that, if I try to be in conversation with you about that, will you respond in defensiveness and shut down? Will you be open to really hearing what I have to say and being committed to being in the work of developing and growing? That's where I wonder and don't always know. Because I have definitely encountered folks who will hear the feedback, be grateful about the feedback, and do their work. But then there's some folks that hear the feedback, deny it, and point to their track record, how many people they helped, how many checks they wrote, as a defense mechanism, right? And rather than get clear about what are people trying to say, what are they trying to offer me as a pathway. So I just offer that we are all in our own unlearning on our own unlearning journeys. It is impossible to live in this society to not have been in some way, shape, or form influenced by the ways in which media, any number of academia, all that influences us. The challenge is, are we going to be honest with ourselves to recognize that it's a constant work of undoing and unlearning, so that I can receive the feedback from myself and others to keep the learning going?
So we've got a bunch of other great questions, only 2 minutes before we have to wrap up. So I'll combine a couple of them for you to then use as your wrap up, Dax. Mark Haas talks about Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, making the point that it's not race per se that's the biggest problem with majorities. As long as everyone knows their place, it is stepping out of place of minorities, as Obama did in becoming president, sort of the backlash to that. And the counties that voted most for Trump had the greatest growth of minority populations.
Yeah.
That's one. We've got another one on, do you have examples of clients that you're working with that are not backsliding? And Mark Eisenberg says, I'm right with you on all your comments today. Inspired. Thank you. So on and so forth. He loves it. And need to get more in touch. So, got a couple of minutes to wrap up.
Yes.
Yes. Caste
So
and positive examples.
So I would say I don't want to name clients. Just got to make it a point that I don't really name my clients. But I will say that there are definitely clients that are deepening the work. Like, there are folks who have had coaching relationships with some executives that have pivoted into more broader relationships with their executive teams. I've had a chance to do a lot of work with executive teams, which I think is really important, because quite often those are the spaces where both a lot needs to be worked out and dealt with. So I'm finding that there are people who are willing and are able, and it's not necessarily because they want to be, it's because their staff and their team are pushing it. So it's what I'm ultimately saying is that it is not always up to the organization whether they backslide or not, because there's so many eyes on them now, the younger staff in particular, saying, I'm watching you, I'm holding you accountable. So that accountability is a real thing that people cannot just walk away from. The question about the observation about Isabel Wilkerson's book, I think what I recognize is that there's something inherent to the feeling of being eliminated or being, or in some way being minoritized that people have and they resist. That's not just an American phenomenon, it exists all over the globe. When people perceive that their position, their power is being diminished, they often run to and they push towards authoritarianism. I'm not the first person to say that. I think it's a very obvious reaction that people have to that sense that they're being eliminated. The challenge and the problem is that that's not what this is about. The work that I do, the work that my colleagues do, we're not trying to squeeze people out, dethrone. Like, that's not what it is. We're just trying to create more inclusive spaces. We're trying to create spaces that are more just. And that is also for white people too. It is not just, I actually think that a lot of the system doesn't work for everybody, including white people, right? I actually think that this racial justice work can actually work in their benefit too. It's the perception that there's somehow displacement that I think is problematic and harmful, and actually misguided and without real precedent and language in any of the work that we're doing. So it's an unfortunate reality that we have to deal with, and I think that it's going to be very clear in 2022 in the midterm elections we have coming up that we're going to see some really we're going to see a lot happening in the next few years in these elections. So I hope that folks are bracing themselves, that they're staying in the work, that they're staying in committed to the work. They're continuing to talk to people in their communities. Just, we have to keep it going, because it's going to get harder now in 2022 and 2024 than it was in 2021, because it was safer to do it then. Now the stakes are real, and now there's going to be a lot more pushback. And I will close by just saying, thank you, Mahan, just having me on this call, in this conversation again. I hope that there was some value that I offered in this space. I know that I talk fast sometimes, but I'm just trying to get a lot of words in. Hit me up. I'm on all the different mediums, but I'm very traditionalist, and you can just email me. You can go to my website if you want to talk more. And thank you for reading the book, for those of you who have done so. I just really appreciate that. And just congratulations for everything y'all are up to at Leadership Greater Washington. I hope to continue to be part of the community in the future.
Yeah, Dax, thank you so much. We're really appreciative of you and all of that you have done, both with your book and the conversations. The LGW leaders are truly committed. LGW was founded 35 years ago, and one of the core principles was the diversity and inclusion that was part of LGW, and has been part of the great work of the leaders in the organization. Having insightful people like you join us adds value, energy, as we do great work together this coming year and many future years. Thank you, all of you, for joining this conversation also. Really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you in the next conversation. Thank you, Dax. Thanks, everyone.
Peace. All right,
Wonderful
y'all.
seeing you.